Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
More than 80% of U.S. critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, putting public-private collaboration at the center of the administration's cyber strategy for America. We'll examine what that partnership needs to look like in practice with John Miller of the Information Technology Industry Council. John, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Terry, it's great to be here. Thank you.
The Trump administration issued its long-awaited cyber strategy for America in early March. ITI was involved in providing input to that and commented on it when it came out. So you've had a few weeks to dig into it a little bit more. From ITI's perspective, what are the big points around industry implementation in this strategy?
Thanks for the question, Terry. I mean, I guess I would just say, first of all, at the top line, I think from the ITI perspective and the industry perspective, I think there's a lot to like in the strategy. It's certainly very positive. I think if we look at it in particular, kind of in comparison to some of the prior strategies we've seen, it really it seems to be focused on empowering the private sector, in a few different ways, kind of shifting from compliance to a more operational partnership model is one of the ways that I think it's doing that. There's a pillar around deregulation and more common sense rules, which is a bit of a departure from some of what we saw in the last administration, where there were, software liability mandates that were put into effect. And, I think there are really some market opportunities around federal procurement, because there's a major focus on modernizing federal networks in the strategy, which is creating, to create a significant demand for, various high-tech solutions, not only AI and quantum, but things like zero trust. I kind of didn't exactly answer your question about implementation, because I think that's probably one of the questions as to, what the implementation details are, because unlike in some of the previous strategies that we've seen, there, at least to date, has not really been an implementation plan published, right? So I think that's one of the questions that is lingering in some folks' minds.
Well, you laid out a great roadmap there. I want to take each of those traffic turns one at a time. Let's start with deregulation, because ITI has long argued that the fragmentation of cyber regulations really slows down both compliance and cybersecurity. Where does this strategy meaningfully change how federal cyber requirements are coordinated and maybe reduced in practice?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I think for as long as I've been working in cybersecurity, which is too long, probably. I think we've been talking about regulatory streamlining, and the reality is that we, a lot of times, compared to, say, Europe, the U.S. is not known as being a regulatory environment, perhaps, on technology regulation, but that's really not the case in cyber. There are lots and lots of different cyber regulations, particularly when we layer on, the various sectoral regulators, right? And, the federal procurement space and everything like that. So, this strategy is very overtly saying, hey, we want to promote common sense regulation, and that, the U.S. is going to aim to streamline cyber regulations and reduce compliance burdens on the private sector, and with the idea being to allow for greater agility against evolving threats. I mean, what does that mean in practice? One thing is it says, we want to get rid of costly compliance checklists and move to risk-based or security. Potentially streamlining overlapping regulations, from agencies like CISA and the SEC. I think on that note in particular, one of the potentially really positive aspects is whether we see in the implementation actual streamlining of security incident notification regulations, right? I mean, that was an area that was identified by the by the last administration, as they're essentially, I think they tallied, they had a cyber incident reporting council that they stood up, and they tallied over 30 different, incident reporting notification regulations. And, if we can streamline even those alone, it would actually do a lot of good for industry. I mean, one of the questions is what's going to happen to the SEC rule that was put forward during the last administration. Another question is what's going to happen to CERCIA, which was the big incident notification rule that CISA has been working on for a few years, and which is now overdue. So though, in the security incident notification space, it's an area where we could definitely see a lot of progress. I mean, I think that the other one that's noteworthy, particularly when we think about what we saw focus on during the last administration, is around software and software liability, right? You've actually seen a walking back of, for instance, the OMB memo that required contractors to submit a form and some of those related types of requirements. So, potentially a good thing. And I'm constantly hedging a little bit here because, again, we haven't necessarily seen what replaces some of these things and how they're implemented. But I think there's a lot of optimism that, from an industry perspective, we'll be in a better place than where we started at the beginning of the administration.
I'm speaking with John Miller. He's General Counsel and Senior VP of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. Well, John, let's continue in that discussion of the regulatory environment, because in a world where you have less regulation, that may be good for innovation, that may be good for technology advancement, but you still need a traffic cop to kind of keep everybody aligned and moving in the same direction. And the strategy places a renewed emphasis on coordination through the Office of the National Cyber Director. From industry's perspective, is ONCD staffed and capable? Do they have the capacity to provide that kind of oversight in this new environment?
I think they do. They're certainly not fully staffed up if you compare, again, to the last administration, but I think they would tell you that they're being, nimble and efficient in that regard. I mean, I do think it's again, I think we're finally seeing ONCD's role as envisioned in the legislation that launched it a few years back starting to materialize. I mean, I think it never quite did in the last administration because you had ONCD, you had CISA, you had the National Security Council, and prominent figures leading all three of those agencies. And I think sometimes from an industry perspective, it was not necessarily clear if there was one traffic cop, as you said, and perhaps there were three. And again, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I do think we have more clarity now as to who is in charge. And so just, that alone, I think is positive. I mean, on the flip side, clearly CISA is still going to have a key operational role in the implementation of various parts of the strategy. And, unfortunately, we still haven't kind of seen a fully staffed up CISA yet during this administration. I mean, there's still no permanent director, and we've obviously had a couple of different government shutdowns, including, the ongoing shutdown affecting, all of DHS, which, is, further depleting their resources. So I'm kind of more concerned with the resources on the CISA side than I am on the ONCD side.
Thinking about those two organizations, you mentioned early on the operational partnership model. 80% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and yet the key government organizations that are needed to partner with industry might be a little less functional than we'd hope. How is this partnership going to play out now?
I mean, that's a great question. One of the other, I think, defining features of the strategy is that, it's really leaning in on the importance of private sector partners and operational collaboration, not only in critical infrastructure, but there's, discussion in there about, offensive cyber and quote unquote unleashing the private sector. I'll put that to the side because that raises a separate set of questions. But getting back to critical infrastructure, one of the things that has hindered operational collaboration, to be candid, during the Trump administration is that we saw a key authority paused, if you will, that the CPAC authorities, the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, which I'm very familiar with because I've participated in various CPAC structures, over the years, including the Sector Coordinating Council, Supply Chain Task Force, as well as others. It's my understanding that those authorities are going to be coming back online very soon. Again, I'll hedge in the sense that nothing is guaranteed until we actually see it happen. But I think that if those authorities come back online, that from a private sector standpoint, we're all kind of on standby and ready, willing, and able to roll up our sleeves and work with the government to CISA, ONCD, and other federal partners, across the critical infrastructure sector risk management agencies. We're ready to go and really roll up our sleeves and implement the plan. And I think that based on conversations with ONCD, I mean, they know that the hard work remains ahead now that the strategy is out. And, I think there's a great willingness to partner and to do that.
Well, John, you just put a pin in the other point you mentioned up top, which was market opportunities and technology. The strategy highlights an AI-enabled cyber defense, supply chain, quantum-related risks. Which of those will require the most near-term coordination between agencies and industries to get them right?
Probably a cop-out to say that we're going to need close partnership on all of them. I guess I would say that, I mean, maybe I'm biased having, again, done so much work on supply chain over the years, but I really do think that to kind of get supply chain right, we really need tight cooperation and coordination amongst the government and the private sector. There are a lot of different reasons for that, but primary amongst them is that we are as the technology industry and certainly ITI members, we're all dealing with large, complex, globally distributed supply chains, and the government just does not have visibility and insight into those supply chains in the same way that the private sector partners do, and so that's why partnering together on initiatives like the Supply Chain Task Force, I think, have been successful because, again, it's kind of, 1 + 1 = more than 2 in that regard is what I would say. I mean, again, I don't want to minimize the importance of collaboration on AI or quantum either. I mean, it's going to be important across the board, but I think there's even less visibility. I just think because of the nature and complexity of supply chains, the government needs the private sector, standing shoulder to shoulder with them to really address those important issues.
And John, you've been pretty clear in our discussion this morning that we don't have the implementation plan that would go along with this strategy. But when you think about the vision that's laid out here, what would you be looking for in terms of concrete actions or signals to tell you that the cyber strategy is being implemented in a way that actually improves security outcomes?
I mean, it's a great question. And, to be clear, at least as I understand it, just because there has not been an implementation plan published doesn't necessarily mean that an implementation plan doesn't exist. And I mean, it could be that they're actually, and again, I've heard different things in this regard, but I mean, it could be that there is an implementation plan and that they're just simply not going to publish it for one reason or another. That might make it a little bit trickier for some in industry, but I think that one of the things that we'll be looking for to know that the plan is being implemented, particularly with respect to how prominent private sector partnership is featured in it, is that I think private sector partners in critical infrastructure sectors and the technology sector should be hearing from the government, from ONCD, from others on what they can do, how they can help, how the government wants to or aspires to to work with the private sector. I mean, it's really just a big question as to exactly what we're going to see. But I mean, if the strategy is being implemented as it's designed, companies, and again, whether we're talking about critical infrastructure, defense contracting, cybersecurity services, I think they're going to see heightened government engagement, and I think that's going to mean that companies are going to have skin in the game too in trying to help make this strategy and the goals a reality. And again, a lot of those goals are things that companies have been asking for a long time, right? Like easing regulatory compliance burdens and things like that. But it's not a free ride, is I guess what I would say.
I've been speaking with John Miller. He's General Counsel and Senior VP of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. John, thanks so much for joining me and breaking this all down for us.
Thank you, Terry. It's been a pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
Sean O'Keefe, former Navy Secretary, NASA Administrator, and senior leader across multiple presidential administrations, reflects on the principles that shaped his long federal career. In this episode of Lessons in Leadership, he joined Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, to discuss motivating teams through uncertainty, leading across agencies, and staying rooted in mission during times of public scrutiny and change.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Sean O'Keefe, former NASA Administrator, former Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, former Secretary of the Navy, former Comptroller and CFO of the Defense Department, and Professor Emeritus at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Public Affairs. Welcome, and thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Shane. Delight to be with you. Appreciate it very much.
What first drew you into public service, and when was it evident to you that leadership was an important part of the roles you played?
Well, I grew up around the public service. My dad was a career naval officer. He was a submariner, and we lived all over the place throughout the country. And as a result, I got an up-close and personal understanding through him, as well as through all the folks he associated with and the environments he was working in, just what the extraordinary value is of public service and what is it that would motivate people to want to be engaged in it and to be really involving themselves in what is something larger than themselves. And the only place that is really formulated properly is within the public sector and the public service. That again is the beneficiary or the beneficiaries are the citizens of the nation, the community, and the region in which you live.
Did you think about leadership early on, saying, I need to be a great leader, and therefore I'm going to learn how to do it, or did you just naturally evolve into it? Any thoughts on that?
I guess it evolved by the great good fortune of being witness to several really extraordinary leaders, people who really did take the initiative to engage others in the task, to pull together and motivate folks to really contribute their very best to achieve an outcome. And I saw the value of that on multiple occasions and found that was the primary ingredient, the trait, the characteristic that needed to be exhibited is the fundamentals of leadership in moving everyone engaged towards a common objective.
You have served under several presidents. Can you talk a little bit about that? What were there challenges to overcome, or were you away from politics so you didn't get? Talk about that a little bit. How does it differ as you serve through a transition, or does leadership stay the same?
Oh no, it's it's really critically important in transition cases, to be sure. But the two presidents that I served in their administrations were President George H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush in two different eras, obviously. But as a consequence, that was the closest I came to understanding the nature of the individuals who were in that ultimate leadership capacity, and their capability to motivate. Both of them are just extraordinarily inspiring people who motivated everybody to be part of the solution. But most importantly, they also had a capacity of really designating what needed to be done, and you knew that they were perfectly prepared to do it themselves, and that made the task that much more achievable. There were several different circumstances in understanding what the objectives of the senior leadership are all about.
You've worked for different kinds of organizations, political administrations, and then government departments, agencies, and then private sector, and now academia. How does that affect your leadership style? Or do you find that leadership, the core tenets of leadership, are applicable no matter what the organization you find yourself in and having to lead? It doesn't matter where you are, that the core leadership characteristics are the same? Are they different? Are you adapting?
Well, there's a common myth in my judgment, and I'm probably the minority view of this in the academic field of public management. That common myth is that you can't apply the same principles in the public sector that you do in the private sector.
Yeah.
I never found that to be an impediment.
Okay.
It was always a circumstance where, strategy, the focus on the talent, people engaged, the process to going through decision making, the integrity imperative that must be there in order to demonstrate the absolute conviction of what's intended here, as well as the moral standing of what it is you're attempting to achieve. All those factors are very much the same. It's going to have its nuances, and there are very distinctive, differentiators within those organizations and those sectors. But at the same time, those basic principles, those tenets, foundations of what make up organizations and organization theory, in so many ways are fundamentally the same. And how you employ those may be slightly nuanced to match the condition, but they all are imperative in the same direction.
A little bit of a different direction. You were part of the very first cohort of what is now Presidential Management Intern Program, later became the Presidential Management Fellows Program. What did that early experience teach you about leading within government?
The Presidential Management Intern Program, as it started, was designed for just that purpose, a focus on public management, a focus on implementation. And its evolution over time has been extraordinary. It mystifies me why that has been the subject now of an executive order that has dismantled it. And it's absolutely unconscionable given the nature of the hundreds, thousands of people who've moved through that program in the course of the last nearly 50 years that have gone on in some cases to be senior executives within the federal government, and in other cases they've moved on to other kinds of pursuits. But even with that, even for those who have left the service, they walked away with an appreciation of what public service is all about, why it matters, and why this is so critical to get it right. Because by and large, the reason why these functions are delegated to the public sector is because no one else can do it. Usually that's the case. It takes that kind of focus of a public entity in order to achieve an outcome that frankly would not be achieved in other spheres. So as a result of that, it gave me an incredibly in-depth understanding of that process at a very early stage in my career that has lasted the entirety of that professional experience.
A closing question. Who has influenced your leadership style, and what about their example stays with you? And that question can be cast broadly. So, inside government, outside government, perhaps not government at all, somebody that you've met, reported to, been mentored by, a broad net. But when you think about broadly, when you think about who has influenced you, who comes to mind?
I would have to say that the number one, hands down, greatest influence during the course of my life was my dad. He was an engineer, so everything was a calculated risk. I think I was probably 25 before I realized the answer was not to be found for everything in a slide rule, but that was his bent and his mindset. And he taught me how to think critically. And it really was one of the most extraordinary attributes. And he was an inspiring parent and mentor in so many ways. And all the different things I've done throughout the course of his life, I had the opportunity through much of it to be able to consult with him on a variety of things, and always walked away with a more informed perspective. Dad was an extraordinary public servant in his own right.
Well, Sean, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences. It has been a pleasure talking.
I'm delighted to be with you, Shane. Thank you so much for doing this.
And this is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until the next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.